The first thing he noticed when the truck rolled to a stop was the silence, the kind that only exists on land that still remembers what it was like before rules, before committees, before strangers decided they could draw lines on soil older than their own houses. And that silence wrapped itself around him as he stared at the steel gate blocking the dirt road that had led to his ranch for 3 generations. The same gate he had welded himself years earlier before deployment pulled him away. The same gate now chained shut with a bright new lock that didn't belong to him, didn't recognize him, didn't care that his boots were still dusted with the sand of somewhere far away, and that his hands still carried the weight of service. Because the land didn't need explanation, but the people standing behind that gate apparently did. Especially the woman already striding toward him with the kind of confidence that comes from believing paperwork matters more than history. Her clipboard held like a shield and her posture stiff with authority that hadn't existed the last time he drove this road, when the horizon was uninterrupted and neighbors waved instead of watched. And as he stepped out of the truck, the air felt heavier than any battlefield memory. Heavier because this was home, and home wasn't supposed to feel contested. He had imagined this moment for months while overseas, the return to the ranch at sunset, the familiar creak of the gate, the smell of dry grass and old wood. But instead there was a line of freshly planted shrubs along the fence and a sign bolted into the dirt declaring private community rules in bold lettering. And the woman didn't slow down as she approached, her expression already set in judgment, already certain that she belonged here more than he did. Because in her world, belonging came from titles and titles came from meetings held in air-conditioned rooms far from the land itself. She stopped a few feet away, not close enough to be neighborly, not far enough to be polite, and the way she looked at him wasn't curious or confused, but offended, as if his presence was an interruption rather than a return, as if the truck with out-of-state dust and military plates was an inconvenience to be removed rather than a man coming home. He stood there, breathing in the familiar and unfamiliar all at once, feeling the disconnect between what the land knew and what the clipboard claimed. And it became immediately clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding that would resolve itself with time, because the woman's eyes were already scanning him like a problem to be solved, already calculating which rule applied to this moment, which number to cite, which authority to invoke. Somewhere behind her, beyond the locked gate, the ranch house roof peeked through the trees, the same house built by his grandfather's hands, now partially hidden by new fencing and ornamental landscaping that didn't belong. And the realization settled in that while he had been gone serving something larger than himself, something smaller but far more invasive had crept in and wrapped itself around his land with bylaws and confidence. The woman raised her phone without hesitation, her thumb moving with practiced ease, and even without hearing a word he could tell what was happening because the posture was universal. The stance of someone calling for backup, someone who believed the system would side with them simply because they had learned how to speak its language. And as she turned slightly away, angling herself for better reception, he noticed the embroidered logo on her jacket. The neat initials that stood for an HOA he'd never agreed to join, never been notified about, never imagined could claim authority over acreage measured in generations rather than property lines drawn for convenience. The call was quick, efficient, rehearsed, and when she ended it she looked satisfied, like someone who had just checked off the most important box on a list. And she didn't bother masking the smug certainty that now hovered around her. The certainty that law enforcement would arrive and confirm what she already believed, that he was out of place, that his return was a violation, that her authority was absolute within the boundaries she imagined existed. He leaned against the truck, arms crossed, not out of defiance but patience learned the hard way, and waited, watching as the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across land that had never needed permission to exist. And in that waiting, the full weight of the situation began to settle, because this wasn't just a locked gate or an aggressive neighbor. This was a collision between lived reality and manufactured control, between land held through sweat and inheritance and land claimed through filings and forgotten clauses. As minutes passed, more residents gathered at a distance, drawn by curiosity and the promise of drama, their faces peering from behind fences and patios like spectators at an unscheduled performance. And none of them recognized him, not as the grandson of the man who once fixed their fences for free, not as the kid who rode horses across these fields before streets had names. Because time had moved on without him and filled the gaps with assumptions, and in those assumptions he was now an outsider. A threat, someone who didn't fit neatly into the rules they'd grown comfortable enforcing. The woman adjusted her stance, squared her shoulders, and positioned herself between him and the gate as if guarding something precious. And it struck him then how power can make people forget origins, how a title can convince someone they own more than they do, how easily confidence becomes arrogance when it goes unchecked. And as distant sirens began to creep into the quiet, he felt no fear, only a strange calm mixed with the knowledge that this moment was bigger than a misunderstanding. That something deeply buried was about to be disturbed. He thought about the paperwork his father had kept in an old safe, documents yellowed with age that detailed boundaries set long before any association existed, and about a survey done decades ago that had settled a dispute that everyone else seemed to have forgotten, and about a clause tucked away in county records that no one had bothered to read because it didn't matter until someone tried to claim what wasn't theirs. And as the sirens grew louder, he realized the woman had no idea what she had just triggered. No idea that her confidence rested on a foundation cracked by a mistake made long before she ever held that clipboard. A mistake that had been ignored because no one challenged it until now. The first patrol car pulled up in a cloud of dust, lights flashing against the fading sky, and the woman straightened even more, her satisfaction nearly visible, while he remained still, grounded by the land beneath his boots, knowing that 5 minutes could change everything, knowing that this call wasn't going to end the way she expected. Knowing that the gate she locked had sealed more than just a road, it had sealed her own fate, and as the officers stepped out and looked between them, the air thick with unspoken tension, the chapter of quiet return closed, and the chapter of reckoning prepared to begin, setting the stage for revelations that would unravel an entire association built on a lie. A process that would start not with anger or shouting, but with the slow, unstoppable grind of truth rising to the surface, waiting for the next moment to break through. The officers approached with the careful neutrality that comes from stepping into a situation where confidence and accusation hang thick in the air. And as they took in the locked gate, the unfamiliar truck, the clipboard bearing HOA president standing rigid with self-assured authority, and the ranch land stretching behind the barrier, the imbalance of the scene quietly announced itself, because land like this carried a presence that paperwork could never fully override. And the returning owner felt it steady him as identification was examined. Records were checked, and the initial assumption of trespass began to fray under the weight of facts that refused to align with the narrative the HOA president had so confidently constructed. The woman's posture remained firm, but subtle shifts betrayed impatience as minutes stretched on, and the officer's attention moved away from her rehearsed certainty toward the older truths embedded in county databases and historical overlays, the kind rarely consulted by associations accustomed to operating unchallenged within newer developments. The ranch owner watched without expression as one officer stepped aside to make a call of his own, not to escalate but to verify, the procedural calm masking the significance of what was unfolding, because the moment official systems begin cross-referencing, the illusion of authority either solidifies or collapses, and in this case it began to wobble. A second patrol car arrived, then a third, not out of alarm but due to the complexity surfacing beneath what was supposed to be a simple removal. And with each arrival, the gathered neighbors leaned closer, sensing that the outcome might not be the routine enforcement they had expected, sensing that something rare was happening in the quiet space between a locked gate and a returning owner who refused to react emotionally. The HOA president attempted to maintain control through body language alone, positioning herself as the rightful gatekeeper. But the officer's questions increasingly bypassed her and focused on the land itself, its recorded boundaries, its historical exemptions, and its relationship to the surrounding parcels that had later been absorbed into a community built on assumptions rather than thorough due diligence. The ranch owner felt the slow surfacing of something he had known but never needed to articulate, that his family's land existed as an anomaly within modern systems, governed by filings that predated zoning shifts and development shortcuts. And as the officer's inquiries deepened, the significance of that anomaly became impossible to ignore. A portable terminal displayed layered maps, old survey lines ghosting beneath newer ones, and the officers exchanged looks that signaled discovery rather than doubt. Because the ranch boundary lines didn't just resist the HOA's claims, they negated them entirely, slicing cleanly through what the association had listed as common controlled access, revealing that the road, the gate, and even the authority asserted over that entrance existed on land never legally ceded, never transferred. never subjected to the covenants now being enforced with such confidence. The HOA president's certainty began to erode, not dramatically but perceptibly, her stance stiffening into something less commanding and more defensive as the officers requested documentation she had never personally examined, references she had trusted without understanding, and approvals she assumed existed because no one had challenged them before. The ranch owner stood quietly as the process unfolded, aware that silence carried more weight than protest, because the truth was already doing the work for him, emerging line by line, record by record, the cumulative result of a mistake made decades earlier when a developer expanded boundaries without resolving an unresolved parcel exclusion. A mistake quietly inherited by every HOA board since, perpetuated through assumption rather than verification. The officers conferred again, this time with county officials looped into the call, and the atmosphere shifted from enforcement to investigation, from resolving a complaint to uncovering a structural fault that had implications far beyond one locked gate. Neighbors began murmuring, their earlier confidence dissolving into uncertainty as the realization spread that the association they relied on for order might not be as solid as they believed, that its reach might have been extended unlawfully over land it never owned, and that the consequences of such an overreach could ripple outward into assessments, fines, and restrictions imposed without valid jurisdiction. The HOA president attempted to reassert herself through procedural familiarity, gesturing toward signage, rules, and established practices, but those gestures now felt hollow against the weight of recorded history unfolding on the officers' screens. And for the first time since the ranch owner's arrival, she looked less like a guardian of order and more like a custodian of a fragile illusion. The officers returned to the gate, examining the lock itself, noting its placement, its attachment to posts that predated the association, and the absence of any recorded easement granting the HOA authority to restrict access. And with that observation, the situation crossed a threshold, because restricting access without legal standing wasn't just an overstep, it was actionable. The ranch owner felt a subtle release of tension as the officers acknowledged what the land had been asserting all along, that he had every right to be there, that the call alleging trespass was unfounded, and that the locked gate represented an unauthorized obstruction rather than a protective measure. As the officers documented the scene, photographs capturing angles that would later matter far more than the moment itself, the HOA president's earlier confidence gave way to visible agitation, her gestures sharper, her movements less controlled, as she realized that the authority she wielded depended entirely on the assumption that no one would ever question its origin. The neighbors, once spectators, now found themselves participants in an unraveling, their expressions reflecting a dawning awareness that the rules governing their daily lives might be built on unstable ground, and that the person they had trusted to enforce those rules might have done so without the legal foundation she believed existed. The officers issued instructions regarding the immediate removal of the lock, not as a favor but as a correction. And as the chain was cut and the gate swung open for the first time in years, the physical act mirrored a larger opening, the release of a long-contained truth into the open air. The ranch owner watched the gate move with quiet satisfaction, not triumph but restoration, feeling the land respond as if relieved. And as he drove forward past the barrier that should never have been there, he knew this was only the beginning because the officer's final remarks hinted at deeper implications, at reviews that would follow, at records that would be scrutinized, and at an association whose authority might not survive the scrutiny it had inadvertently invited. As the patrol cars departed and the gathered neighbors dispersed in uneasy silence, the HOA president remained standing near the now open gate, her clipboard lowered for the first time, the weight of what had been set in motion settling heavily around her. And the ranch owner continued down the familiar road toward his house, aware that the quiet return he had imagined was gone forever, replaced by a slow-moving reckoning that would expose every corner of the association's foundation. A reckoning that would begin not with anger or revenge, but with the unavoidable momentum of truth moving forward, carrying the promise of consequences that would soon reach far beyond this gate and into the very existence of the HOA itself, setting the stage for the next chapter of unraveling that no one involved could stop. The following days unfolded with a deceptive calm that masked the seismic shift already underway beneath the surface, because while the ranch returned to its familiar rhythms of wind through grass and quiet mornings, the The surrounding community vibrated with uncertainty, rumors spreading faster than facts as neighbors replayed the scene at the gate from every possible angle, each retelling adding weight to the realization that something fundamental had cracked. And at the center of it all sat the HOA president. Buried in documents she had never truly read before, discovering for the first time how fragile her authority really was when stripped of assumption. County officials moved methodically, initiating formal reviews triggered by the officer's findings, and those reviews reached deep into records most associations never revisit once established, pulling out old plats, annexation filings, easement agreements, and developer correspondence that told a far messier story than the clean narrative the HOA had relied upon for years. The ranch owner, meanwhile, found himself contacted not by neighbors, but by attorneys, surveyors, and clerks seeking clarification, each conversation reinforcing the same truth, that his land existed as a legal outlier deliberately excluded from the development decades earlier due to unresolved access disputes and water rights considerations. Exclusions that had been quietly ignored when the HOA expanded its perceived boundaries without securing the necessary amendments. As survey crews arrived to mark lines with flags and stakes, the visual representation of those boundaries shocked residents who had grown accustomed to thinking of the community as a single, unified entity, because the markers cut through landscaped areas, common paths, and even portions of what had been marketed as shared amenities, revealing that the HOA's footprint had never been as solid as advertised. The HOA president attempted damage control through emails and notices framed as routine reviews, but the tone rang hollow against the growing awareness that assessments, fines, and restrictions might have been imposed beyond legal reach. An awareness that transformed quiet compliance into cautious scrutiny among homeowners who suddenly questioned the legitimacy of every rule they had followed without protest. The ranch owner observed this unraveling from a distance, not out of indifference but strategy, understanding that the most effective pressure came not from confrontation, but from letting institutions collide with their own oversights. And as the county's preliminary findings circulated, it became increasingly clear that the mistake anchoring the entire situation wasn't minor or recent but structural. A decades-old failure to resolve a parcel exclusion that invalidated the HOA's authority over critical access points, including the gate that had sparked everything. Legal notices followed, formal and unemotional, outlining potential violations related to unlawful restriction of access, misrepresentation of jurisdiction, and failure to maintain accurate governing documents, each notice adding another layer of gravity that the HOA president could no longer deflect with confidence or procedural familiarity. Homeowners began requesting copies of founding documents, minutes from early meetings, and proof of annexation approvals, requests that strained an association unprepared for transparency because it had never needed to justify itself before, and the absence of clear answers fueled a quiet but powerful shift in loyalty away from leadership toward accountability. The ranch owner's own attorney confirmed what the land records suggested, that the HOA's actions not only lacked authority but exposed it to liability, and that the county's involvement significantly narrowed the association's options, transforming what might have been a private dispute into a public compliance issue with statutory consequences. The HOA president, once buoyed by the certainty of her role, now faced mounting pressure from within her own community, board members questioning past decisions, residents demanding clarity, and the looming reality that ignorance of foundational flaws offered no protection from their fallout. Meetings grew tense, attendance swelled, and the narrative carefully curated over years began to fracture as facts replaced assumptions, revealing that the association's expansion had been built on a chain of unverified inheritances rather than explicit legal authority. The ranch owner became a reference point in these discussions, not as an aggressor, but as proof that the HOA's reach had limits it had chosen to ignore, and his quiet presence in official correspondence underscored the imbalance between lived ownership and manufactured control. As the county scheduled formal hearings to address the findings, the stakes escalated, because such hearings didn't simply correct errors, they documented them, creating records that would permanently alter the association's standing and expose it to scrutiny from agencies that measured compliance without regard for intent. The HOA president's attempts to rally support increasingly fell flat, as homeowners recognized that the association's credibility hinged not on enforcing rules, but on its ability to demonstrate lawful existence within its claimed boundaries. And that ability was slipping away with every uncovered inconsistency. The ranch owner returned to his routines, repairing fences, walking the land, re-establishing connections that had waited patiently for his return. And in doing so, he reclaimed not just physical space but narrative control, because the contrast between his grounded stewardship and the association's unraveling authority became impossible to ignore. As notices of potential enforcement actions circulated and legal counsel advised the HOA to prepare for outcomes that included restructuring or dissolution, the weight of the original 911 call took on new significance, no longer a moment of perceived vigilance, but the catalyst that exposed a fundamental flaw. And as the community braced for the upcoming hearings, the sense of inevitability grew stronger, setting the stage for a confrontation not driven by emotion or revenge, but by the slow, methodical alignment of law, history, and land. A convergence that would soon force a definitive resolution and push the story into a chapter where authority itself would be put on trial. The weeks leading up to the county hearing carried a weight that pressed down on the entire community, transforming everyday routines into subdued performances under an unspoken sense of anticipation. Because by then, it was no longer a question of whether something was wrong, but how deep the wrongness went, and who would be left standing once it was fully exposed. The HOA, once a background presence enforcing tidy rules and predictable order, had become the central subject of scrutiny, its authority questioned in ways most residents had never imagined possible. And the ranch owner, without raising his voice or demanding attention, stood as the quiet axis around which everything now revolved. County officials compiled reports that traced the association's history back to its earliest filings, mapping a timeline riddled with gaps, assumptions, and inherited errors that painted a picture far less stable than the glossy welcome packets ever suggested. And as those reports circulated among legal teams and board members, the realization set in that this was not a single oversight but a cascading failure, each board trusting the last, each expansion accepted without verification, each rule enforced on the belief that legitimacy was automatic rather than earned. The HOA president found herself isolated by this process, her earlier confidence eroded by the relentless neutrality of bureaucratic review, because the system she had relied on to validate her authority was now examining her association with the same detached rigor it applied to any entity, and intent or good faith offered no insulation against factual deficiency. Residents watched the transformation unfold through leaked summaries and whispered updates, the atmosphere thick with uncertainty as homeowners confronted the possibility that years of dues, fines, and restrictions may have been imposed by an organization operating beyond its lawful scope. A realization that sparked a mix of anger, fear, and disbelief that no amount of reassurance could soothe. The ranch owner continued his measured approach, cooperating fully with requests for documentation, granting survey access, and allowing officials to walk boundaries that had never truly been in dispute until someone tried to control them. And in doing so, he reinforced the stark contrast between transparency rooted in ownership and authority propped up by assumption. As the hearing date approached, the HOA board scrambled to present a unified front, but unity proved fragile when faced with evidence that implicated not just leadership, but the structural legitimacy of the association itself. And internal divisions widened as members debated whether to defend the past or prepare for consequences that seemed increasingly unavoidable. The community center, once a neutral space for meetings and events, took on a new significance as preparations were made for the hearing, its walls set to contain a reckoning that would determine whether the HOA could continue to exist in its current form. And residents marked the date with a mix of dread and reluctant curiosity, aware that the outcome would ripple into property values, governance, and daily life. County attorneys refined their arguments with methodical precision, focusing not on personalities or motivations, but on compliance, authority, and jurisdiction. Because in their view, the matter was simple. Either the HOA possessed lawful control over the areas it governed, or it did not, and the accumulating evidence suggested a decisive answer. The ranch owner reviewed the findings with his own counsel, recognizing the gravity of what was unfolding, not as a personal victory, but as a systemic correction that would restore balance between land and law. And as he prepared to attend the hearing, he understood that his presence alone underscored the central contradiction at the heart of the dispute. A man whose family had held uninterrupted title, for generations being treated as an intruder by an organization whose claim rested on unchecked paperwork. The day before the hearing, tension peaked as homeowners demanded last-minute explanations. Board members issued carefully worded statements, and the HOA president attempted to project stability despite the strain evident in every movement, because the reality she faced was no longer abstract but imminent, and the authority she had exercised so freely now hung in the balance. When the hearing finally arrived, the room filled with residents, officials, and observers drawn by the gravity of a decision that would set precedent not just for this community, but for how far associations could extend themselves without consequence. And as the proceedings began, the atmosphere shifted from speculation to accountability. Evidence was presented in a steady stream, maps layered with annotations, records cross-referenced against statutes, timelines reconstructed to expose the moment where assumption replaced authorization. And with each exhibit, the association's foundation appeared less like an oversight and more like a house built on sand. The ranch owner listened as history aligned with law, his presence a living reminder that land remembers even when institutions forget. And as officials outlined the implications of unauthorized governance, the realization spread through the room that the issue extended beyond one gate or one call to law enforcement, reaching into the core validity of the HOA's existence. By the time the hearing adjourned, no ruling yet issued but conclusions heavily implied, the collective understanding had shifted irreversibly, because the narrative of order and control had been replaced by one of overreach and consequence. And as residents filed out in hushed silence, the weight of what was coming settled over the community like a gathering storm. The HOA president lingered behind, surrounded by documents that no longer offered protection, while the ranch owner stepped back onto land that had already rendered its verdict, knowing that the next chapter would bring not just answers but finality, and that the system now in motion would move forward with or without the consent of those it judged, carrying the story toward a resolution that would redefine authority, ownership, and the very idea of control within this once unquestioned association. The days after the hearing felt suspended in an uneasy stillness, the kind that follows a thunderclap when everyone knows the storm has not passed, but is merely gathering itself for the final strike. And throughout the community, conversations softened into murmurs as residents waited for the county's written determination, fully aware that whatever arrived in that envelope would permanently reshape the landscape of power they had lived under for years. The HOA board attempted to maintain normal operations, sending out routine notices and reminders, but the effort felt performative, because the authority behind those messages had already been hollowed out by the hearing's revelations, and homeowners no longer responded with automatic compliance, choosing instead to watch, wait, and question. The ranch owner returned to a slower rhythm, repairing a barn roof damaged during his absence, checking water lines, and reconnecting with neighbors beyond the association's boundaries, actions that grounded him while the surrounding development drifted in uncertainty. And in that contrast, the difference between stewardship and control became increasingly apparent. When the county's preliminary determination finally circulated, it did so without drama, its language precise and unemotional. Yet the impact was immediate and profound, because it confirmed what many had already suspected, that the HOA had exercised authority over areas and access points without lawful jurisdiction, rendering significant portions of its governance actions invalid. The document outlined deficiencies that could not be cured through simple amendment, emphasizing that the original exclusion of the ranch parcel and associated access routes had never been resolved, and that subsequent expansions of the association's control rested on assumptions rather than explicit legal authorization. Homeowners reacted in waves, some with anger at leadership, others with fear about property values and future governance, and still others with a sense of vindication for long-held grievances that had been dismissed under the association's unquestioned rule. The HOA president's attempts to frame the determination as a technical hurdle fell flat, because the language of the findings left little room for reinterpretation. And as residents began sharing excerpts and seeking independent legal advice, the balance of power shifted decisively away from the board. Emergency meetings were called, attendance swelling beyond capacity as homeowners demanded clarity, accountability, and a plan, and the once orderly proceedings descended into disarray as conflicting interests collided, some residents advocating for restructuring while others questioned whether the association should exist at all. The ranch owner remained on the periphery of these gatherings, not out of disinterest, but because his role had already been defined by the facts, and his absence from the chaos underscored that the issue was no longer about him personally, but about an institution confronting its own illegitimacy. Legal counsel advised the board that the path forward was narrow and fraught, involving either a costly and uncertain attempt to retroactively validate authority through complex agreements or an orderly dissolution under county supervision. And the weight of that advice settled heavily on members who had once believed their positions were secure. Homeowners began organizing independently, forming informal groups to discuss alternatives, some exploring the possibility of voluntary neighborhood associations without enforcement power, others considering complete autonomy free from centralized control. And in those discussions, the assumptions that had sustained the HOA began to unravel as residents imagined life beyond the structure they had taken for granted. The ranch owner received notice that further restrictions imposed by the HOA would be unenforceable pending final resolution, a formal acknowledgement that the gate incident had exposed a broader pattern of overreach. And as he walked the land freely, he felt the quiet satisfaction of restoration, not as a victory over neighbors, but as a correction of balance long overdue. The county scheduled follow-up proceedings to finalize the outcome, making clear that failure to address the deficiencies would result in dissolution, and that clarity transformed uncertainty into inevitability, because the association lacked both the authority and the unity required to repair a foundation compromised from its inception. The HOA president, once the embodiment of confidence, now faced mounting pressure from all sides, her leadership questioned openly, her decisions scrutinized retroactively, and the reality that her defining moment of authority had instead become the catalyst for collapse weighed visibly upon her. As homeowners withdrew consent, withheld dues, and challenged enforcement, the association's operational capacity eroded rapidly, turning what had once been an orderly system into a shell struggling to justify its existence. The ranch owner observed these developments with measured detachment, recognizing that the process unfolding was not fueled by emotion, but by structure correcting itself. And as the final proceedings approached, the community braced for an outcome that would bring closure but also require adaptation. Because the end of an HOA was not merely an administrative change, but a fundamental shift in how neighbors related to one another. The anticipation of that decision hung in the air as winter approached, the landscape settling into a quieter state that mirrored the collective pause before resolution. And in that pause, the truth became unavoidable, that the call made at a locked gate had set in motion a chain of events no one could reverse, events that would soon culminate in a definitive end to an association built on unchecked assumptions, setting the stage for the chapter where the final decision would be rendered and its consequences fully realized. The final county proceedings arrived not with spectacle, but with an air of administrative inevitability, as if the outcome had already been written, and the meeting existed only to formalize what everyone now understood. And that quiet certainty weighed heavily on the community as residents gathered one last time under the banner of an association that was already, in practice if not yet on paper, coming apart. The county officials presented their conclusions with measured clarity, outlining the steps taken, the deficiencies confirmed, and the opportunities for correction that had been considered and ultimately deemed unviable. Because the flaw at the heart of the HOA was not procedural but existential, rooted in an origin that never lawfully included the land and access it claimed, and therefore incapable of being repaired without unraveling the very structure it sought to preserve. The report detailed how the decades-old exclusion of the ranch parcel had invalidated subsequent assumptions of continuity, how each successive board had inherited authority they never truly possessed, and how enforcement actions taken under that authority now existed in a gray zone of unenforceability that exposed the association to ongoing liability if allowed to continue. Homeowners listened in a silence that felt heavier than anger, because by this point the emotional arc had already played out, and what remained was the sober recognition that something once treated as permanent was, in fact, remarkably fragile when stripped of its legal scaffolding. The HOA president sat among them, no longer elevated by position or posture, just another resident facing the consequences of a role that had promised control but delivered collapse, and her presence served as a reminder that authority borrowed without verification inevitably demands repayment. The county's final determination was delivered in precise language that left no room for interpretation, formally declaring the HOA dissolved due to lack of lawful jurisdiction over its claimed boundaries and access points, and instructing the immediate cessation of all enforcement actions, collection of dues, and representation of authority, effectively ending the association's existence in a single, irreversible motion. The room absorbed the decision slowly, the finality settling in as residents realized that the rules shaping their daily lives had vanished not through rebellion or reform, but through correction, erased by the same legal framework that had allowed them to exist in the first place. The ranch owner felt the moment less as triumph and more as resolution, because the outcome restored a balance that had been disrupted by assumption rather than intent. And as officials outlined the transitional steps for the community, including the transfer of any remaining assets and the clarification of individual property responsibilities, it became clear that the future would require neighbors to negotiate directly rather than defer to centralized control. In the days that followed, the physical symbols of the HOA began to disappear, signs removed, notices taken down, enforcement letters rendered meaningless, and with each removal the environment subtly shifted, as if the land itself was shedding a layer that no longer belonged. Homeowners navigated this new reality with varying reactions, some relieved by the sudden autonomy, others anxious about the absence of structure, but all forced to confront the fact that compliance had replaced communication for far too long, and that rebuilding trust would take more effort than enforcing rules ever had. The ranch owner watched these changes from the edge of the community, aware that his role in the dissolution was complete, yet conscious that the consequences would continue to unfold long after the paperwork was filed, because dismantling an institution was easier than undoing the habits it instilled. The former HOA president retreated from visibility, her once frequent emails and notices replaced by silence, and in that absence the community was left to reckon not just with her actions, but with their own willingness to accept authority without question, a reckoning that proved more uncomfortable than any fine or warning ever had. Informal meetings sprang up among neighbors, discussions replacing directives, and while disagreements still surfaced, they carried a different tone, one rooted in mutual dependence rather than imposed hierarchy, signaling the slow emergence of a more organic, if less predictable, form of governance. The ranch owner reopened access routes that had been quietly restricted for years, restoring pathways that reconnected the land in ways many residents had never experienced. And as people adjusted to the expanded sense of space, the artificial boundaries once enforced began to feel increasingly absurd in hindsight. Legal follow-ups continued, addressing refunds, liability releases, and the administrative closure of the association. But these were procedural echoes of a decision already absorbed by the community. And as winter settled in, the landscape returned to a quieter state that mirrored the internal reset taking place among residents. The story of the dissolved HOA began to circulate beyond the neighborhood, discussed in forums, and shared among those wary of unchecked associations, not as a tale of rebellion, but as a cautionary example of what happens when governance drifts too far from its legal foundation. And the ranch owner's name became associated not with conflict, but with a reminder that ownership carries both rights and responsibilities that no committee can override without consequence. As the final documents were filed and the county closed its case, the chapter of institutional authority ended, leaving behind a community in transition, and a man returned to land that had always been his, setting the stage for the final chapter where the long-term consequences of that 5-minute decision would fully reveal themselves, reshaping not just a neighborhood, but the understanding of power, accountability, and the quiet strength of standing on ground that knows your name. In the months following the dissolution, the community entered a strange, unfamiliar season where the absence of authority was louder than any rule had ever been. Because for the first time in years, there was no centralized voice dictating acceptable behavior, no fines threatening compliance, and no emails arriving with the weight of obligation. And that silence forced every resident to confront how deeply the HOA had shaped their sense of order. At first, uncertainty dominated daily life as neighbors tested the boundaries of newfound autonomy, some cautiously, others boldly, and the ranch owner observed this adjustment from a distance, understanding that freedom without habit can feel disorienting, especially for those accustomed to being told where responsibility ended and enforcement began. Small conflicts surfaced quickly: parking disputes, maintenance disagreements, questions about shared roads and drainage, issues once delegated upward now requiring direct conversation. And while these moments sparked frustration, they also revealed something long suppressed: the necessity of communication over compliance. The ranch owner, grounded in the rhythms of land ownership, became an unintentional reference point for this shift, not because he sought influence, but because his approach embodied a model of stewardship rooted in respect rather than control, and neighbors began to seek his perspective on matters the HOA would once have dictated, discovering that collaboration often resolved what authority had only managed. The physical landscape continued to change as well, with uniform signage replaced by individual expression, lawns reflecting personal preference rather than enforced standards, and the gradual disappearance of the rigid aesthetic that had once defined the community. And while some worried about declining order, others found relief in the authenticity returning to a place that had felt increasingly artificial. The former HOA president remained largely absent, her role reduced to a cautionary memory rather than an active presence. And in her absence, the community confronted the uncomfortable truth that the association's power had persisted not because it was flawless, but because it was unquestioned, a realization that prompted deeper reflection on how easily authority becomes normalized when it promises convenience. The ranch owner resumed hosting small gatherings on his land, informal and unstructured, spaces where neighbors could meet without agendas or enforcement. And these moments fostered a renewed sense of connection that the HOA's meetings had never achieved, because they were rooted in shared experience rather than obligation. As seasons changed, the community adapted, developing informal agreements and voluntary collaborations to address shared needs, from road maintenance to emergency preparedness. And while the process was slower and sometimes messier than centralized governance, it carried a resilience born of mutual investment rather than imposed compliance. Stories of the dissolved HOA continued to spread beyond the neighborhood, circulating among homeowners wary of overreach, and the ranch owner found himself contacted by people seeking understanding rather than strategy, individuals curious how a single call had unraveled an entire institution. And in those conversations, the pattern became clear: that the collapse was not sudden, but the inevitable result of authority divorced from verification. The community's relationship with the land evolved as well, as access once restricted became normalized, paths reopened, and residents experienced parts of the area previously hidden behind rules, and that expanded familiarity fostered appreciation, reminding many that the land existed long before governance structures and would endure long after them. Conflicts still arose, because autonomy does not eliminate disagreement, but the way they were handled shifted noticeably, with neighbors more inclined to negotiate directly, aware that escalation no longer carried institutional backing, and this awareness cultivated a cautious respect that had been absent under enforced hierarchy. The ranch owner reflected often on the moment at the gate, recognizing how easily the situation could have escalated had he responded with anger rather than patience, and how the choice to let systems confront their own errors had preserved not just his rights, but the community's opportunity to reset. As trust slowly rebuilt through shared responsibility, the community began to resemble something closer to a neighborhood than an association, its identity shaped by relationships rather than regulations. And while imperfections remained, they were openly acknowledged rather than hidden behind procedural certainty. The legacy of the HOA's dissolution settled into collective memory as a lesson rather than a grievance, a reminder that authority must always be grounded in legitimacy, and that convenience should never replace accountability. And as the ranch owner walked his land at dusk, watching lights flicker on across properties no longer bound by a single rulebook, he sensed that the final chapter was approaching, one where reflection would give way to understanding, and where the true consequences of that 5-minute decision would finally come into focus, not as revenge or triumph, but as a quiet restoration of balance between people, power, and the land they share. Time carried the story forward in a way no ruling or document ever could, smoothing the sharp edges of conflict and revealing the deeper patterns that had always been there, waiting to be noticed once the noise of authority faded. And as the final year unfolded, the community settled into a rhythm that felt less managed and more lived, shaped by relationships rather than regulations. The ranch owner became, in many ways, a symbol of this transition, not because he sought recognition, but because his return had coincided with the unmasking of a system that had quietly replaced trust with control. And in the space left behind, something more resilient began to grow. Neighbors who once measured compliance now measured cooperation, understanding that shared spaces required shared effort rather than enforced obedience. And while disagreements still emerged, they were approached with an awareness that solutions depended on dialogue rather than escalation. The land itself seemed to breathe easier, access routes fully restored, fences aligned with reality rather than assumption, and the visual clarity of true boundaries reinforcing a sense of honesty that had been missing, reminding everyone that lines drawn without consent or authority eventually fade. The story of the dissolved HOA reached a wider audience, discussed not as a spectacle of revenge, but as a cautionary example of what happens when governance drifts away from legitimacy. And in those retellings, the focus often returned to the moment of overconfidence that set everything in motion, a reminder that power exercised without understanding invites consequences it cannot control. The former HOA president faded into anonymity, her name rarely spoken, not out of malice, but because the community had moved on, recognizing that focusing on blame offered less value than learning from the experience. And in that quiet forgetting, there was a form of closure that allowed healing to take root. The ranch owner continued his life with a renewed sense of purpose, his connection to the land deepened by the knowledge that stewardship required vigilance as much as care. And that ownership was not just a right, but a responsibility to challenge overreach when it threatened balance. Seasons passed, and with them the memory of rigid rules softened into stories shared over gatherings and workdays, reminders of a time when authority had felt permanent until it wasn't. And those stories carried a subtle warning that resonated beyond the neighborhood, reinforcing the idea that systems endure only as long as they remain grounded in consent and law. The community's identity evolved organically, no longer defined by an acronym or board, but by the shared experience of navigating life without a central authority. And while imperfections persisted, they were embraced as part of a living environment rather than flaws to be fined away. The ranch owner often reflected on the 5-minute decision that had altered everything, recognizing that the call made in certainty had exposed a truth long ignored, and that restraint, rather than confrontation, had allowed that truth to surface without destroying relationships. As new families moved in, they learned the story not as a warning against neighbors, but as a lesson in accountability, a narrative that emphasized the importance of questioning authority and understanding the foundations of governance before surrendering autonomy. The land continued to anchor these lessons, its history etched into the soil and structures that outlasted any association, a constant reminder that ownership and stewardship transcend administrative constructs. In quiet moments at dusk, the ranch owner would stand at the once locked gate, now open and unmarked, and consider how easily it could have remained closed had no one challenged the assumption behind it. And that thought reinforced his belief that vigilance, patience, and respect for history were essential safeguards against overreach. The community thrived in its own imperfect way, stronger for having confronted a truth rather than avoided it. And the story concluded not with applause or vindication, but with a deeper understanding of balance, where authority serves rather than dominates, and where land, law, and people align not through force but through recognition. In the end, the HOA's dissolution was not a tale of revenge, but a reminder that power, when exercised without foundation, collapses under its own weight, and that sometimes the most profound change begins with a quiet refusal to accept what never truly belonged, a lesson etched into the land and carried forward by those who learned to listen.